We've got a select group today, and that certainly does not reflect quality of our speaker. It's more that we're a little bit behind in getting things underway, and so we're delighted that Danielle's here today. And I'm going to let you introduce yourself, Danielle, but I will say that Danielle is highly qualified to talk on concussion in sport. She's currently a research scientist for New Zealand Rugby, and she conducts the injury surveillance for Super Rugby and its leading NZ Community Rugby Concussion Initiative.
Cool, no, thank you.
So thank you so much.
Yeah, I'm sure.
We're doing a lot.
No, thanks for having me, guys. So yeah, I guess a few things that I'll be up front with is unfortunately I come from my mom's side of the family is all pirates. So they used to run rum up the east coast of Canada from Jamaica. So unfortunately, I swear like a sailor, so I just have to apologize up front. So hopefully that doesn't offend. I try and keep it in, but it just pops out. So full disclosure, there may be a few swear words that pop out, and hopefully that doesn't offend anybody. But yeah, so my background is I came over from Canada where I did my master's, and I'm a physio by trade, but kind of got into the research through having beers with a friend, and he needed somebody to design a neck rehab program for rugby or for the military. So I kind of got involved in that project, and then kind of got passionate about chronic neck pain and exercise programs for that, and kind of thought, oh, it'd be cool to do something in sports, and then kind of reached out and ended up getting a scholarship to come down to Otago and did my PhD there, looking at neck pain in rugby. And I'd never seen a rugby game till I came to New Zealand, so it was a bit of a steep learning curve. But yeah, at Otago, I worked with Phil Hancock and John Sullivan, and he had connections with Pete Gallagher, who's a physio for the All Blacks, so he connected us in with Mike Cron, and we came together and we designed this neck strength device. And I think it was the first AB game that was down at Dunedin at Carisbrook, and Mike, they were down the week before training, and Mike asked me to test his forwards with this device that we built, and I said sure. And the first person I tested was Kevin Mialama, who's, if you ever have a chance to meet him, he's a lovely man, but he came in and we were just having a chat, and he told me it was a hooker, and I guess where I come from, Canada, hooker is something very different than a rugby position, so it gives you my context. So I'm not qualified to speak to rugby, but I have over the last couple of years done a lot of work in concussions, so totally relatively informal. If you have any questions at any point, just sing out, and I'm happy to make it really interactive. So this is just some of the research that we've done. So if there's anything that kind of spikes your interest over the course of the talk, let me know, and I can flick through some of our papers. But yeah, we've, for the last 3 years, been working on a community concussion initiative that's really has been funded by World Rugby, and it's also been supported by ACC through the Rugby Smart program and by the New Zealand Rugby Foundation. So we do have kind of a wide body of work that's really focused primarily in the high school space and how we kind of manage concussions and kind of everything around that. So yeah, so there's just some of the papers, but again, I'm happy to share those if anybody's interested after. But I just wanted to give you context, because often, despite probably what you hear in the media, concussions don't just happen in rugby. Concussions happen everywhere. And it's really, when we look at sports, about 20% of concussions that happen in New Zealand are a result of sport-related activities. And then you can kind of see, of those, ACC kind of call their priority 6, which rugby is one of those. And of those, but there's about 5,000 concussions that happen in those sports. And we do account for the majority of those. So about half of those concussions happen as a result of rugby. So just gives you a bit of context. And this is just, pardon me?
What time period was that?
So this was the 2018 calendar year. Yeah. So it gives, and just so you quite can't see, as home and community is a blue. So those are kind of the numbers of concussions that happen as a result of activities at home and community. Then you've got your work and your road related, which kind of covers your transport to and from work or to and from school. Again, this is just a close-up of the number of concussions that happened. So again, we talk about those priority 6, and we account for about half of those. I think this is where it gets into more of an interesting area. Is this looks at the average cost that ACC pays out for each of their TBI claims. So this is how much money does each concussion cost. So you can kind of see what sport actually doesn't account for a lot. The majority of the costs for concussions, they seem to happen outside of that. And I think a lot of that has to do is we as a society probably do a better job of managing sport-related concussions than we do those that happen in the community. But I think that kind of the cool thing is when we dive into the stats in around the sports, what you can kind of see is actually rugby is the 3rd lowest cost per sport for their concussion claims. So what this would suggest is we're doing a good job of catching our concussions that aren't very complex, so that resolve probably within that 4 weeks. We're getting a lot of those, which keeps our costs down. Also, potentially we're doing a good job in initially managing those concussions through the guidelines that rugby has, so they're not being referred into the service.
Does the K delineate?
So that's 1,000, so that's $24,000.
Is that per individual?
No, so that's, yeah, the average cost.
Average cost.
Yeah, so for example, if I got concussed, it probably costs ACC about $2,400 to manage my recovery. So that would cover lost wages, my doctor's visits, any physio treatment I get through that. So that kind of encompasses all that. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
But that's the cost they know about, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
So if you said how much is it unreported,
Oh,
it still has
absolutely.
impact.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think
I'm really surprised about the swimming statistics. Very high.
yeah, well, and particularly, which is probably not surprising, but if we look at mountain biking, you know, it's quite funny because I don't know how many times I've sat, you know, at a hairdresser's talking to, you know, just talking chat, and the woman's like, oh, I never let my son play rugby, but he's off mountain biking. I was like, well, actually, do you know? He's better off playing rugby than he is mountain biking. But yeah, so it's just, again, and it's just, you know, concussions are a serious injury, and we need to ensure that we do have proper management. But I think part of the conversation is we need to ensure that people do know that concussions happen in rugby, but they're actually doing a pretty good job of managing it. But the reality is concussions happen everywhere. And hopefully what we'll learn through this presentation, and hopefully what my goal is to help improve concussions that happen everywhere, not just rugby, because I think the concussion that happens in rugby is no different from the guy who falls off a ladder fixing his roof. You know, a concussion is a concussion. We just have to make sure that there's a good level of support for everybody.
Just got one question.
Yeah.
There isn't anything there about motorbike riding?
Yeah, so that would be,
because that I know.
oh, sorry, that's the wrong.
I don't experience it.
Yeah, so that would fall into, so if you look at the road-related costs there, the green bubble,
Oh, okay.
so it's $51K for driving a passenger or motorcycle.
No, I'm thinking the sport.
Oh, yes.
So that's not recorded there.
No,
That's where-
and I think potentially that the way ACC codes are 45, I don't know if that would actually, so if I was involved in a sporting related event, you know, a race for motorbike, I think,
Maybe motorsport isn't considered sport.
no, I think that would
It's a
fall,
motor thing rather than-
yeah, it would fall into the work related stuff.
Yeah, that would be a good point.
Yeah,
That makes
but
sense.
nah, it's huge.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely, yeah.
So there's something missing there.
Yeah, no, and I think the one thing too is this just looks at the average cost, but I think the key thing is there's a lot of other sports where they don't get a lot of concussions, but they are quite hefty financially. So if you look at, I don't think equestrian is, you know, there's not a lot of people that ride horses, but when you ass off a horse from that height and hit your head, the concussion is pretty severe. So yeah, it kind of gives us a rough estimate, but there's definitely a lot of pieces that are missing there.
Is there a reason why they talk about priority sports as a separate program?
I think the priority sports are what costs the sports that cost ACC the most money. And I think that's probably not as a result of the injuries are the most costly, but because there's a large majority of people participating, there's more injuries, which there's more costs. So I think the priority 6, all ACC funds, kind of a rugby smart, a rugby league smart, so they do fund money into that injury prevention stuff, specifically for that sport. Any other questions with that?
Just out of curiosity, what's the source of injuries in swimming? Are we just powering down the lane and hitting the...
Yeah, so potentially, yeah, I suspect too, and a lot of backstroke where people whack their head on the wall doing turns or collide, potentially diving as well. So I think they would fall. That was always a question. How do you get concussed in swimming? But yeah, yeah. Cool. So I guess, does everybody quite familiar? I know I'm probably preaching, but everybody familiar with what a concussion is? Yeah. So I guess I'll just give you the quick and dirty of it. But what it is kind of, yeah. So the brain's kind of, the head's designed, so if you think of my skull as, or my arms as my skull, the head's kind of, my brain floats inside my skull. So it's kind of floated in what we call cerebrospinal fluid. So it's kind of floating in my skull. And what happens is when I get an direct impact, so I whack my head against the ground or, the wall, it bounces. But it also can result from indirect impact. So if somebody was to hit me in my guts with a tackle and I fold over and you get that whiplash. So concussions can happen from a direct hit to the head or a hit to the body as well. So what happens is when I get hit, my brain kind of bounces around, but because my brain's attached to my spinal cord, it doesn't bounce freely. So what happens is when it bounces and rotates, it twists. And what happens is when we twist the brain, our brain's made up of these kind of neurons, and the neurons have kind of little fingers, and these neurons communicate by releasing chemicals from the neurons from one side to the neurons on the other side. And what happens is when we stretch those neurons, it's not a happy place for them. So what they tend to do is they tend to dump all the chemicals into the space and they kind of stop working. So really the definition of a concussion is a transient impairment of brain function. So what's happened is those nerve cells have dumped the chemicals, so they stop kind of working for a period of time. And it takes the body, they call it a metabolic cascade, but all that means is it takes the body a while to get all those chemicals back into the neurons and replenish those. So that's kind of the definition of a concussion. If there's, bleeding, damage to any part of the brain, that steps away from what they call a mild traumatic brain injury, which is a concussion into your moderate severe. So kind of the definition of concussion is a transient impairment of brain function. Does that make sense? Cool. And the one thing I was going to talk is when we look at, if we go back to that 2018 slide, we know there was about 2,500 concussions that happened in 2018. And what we do know is our largest participating numbers in rugby is that 13 to 18-year-old demographics, also where we see the majority of our concussions happen in that high school group. And in that high school group, the majority of those seem to happen to males. And we do have, given the makeup of New Zealand, a large majority of those concussions, or a higher percentage of concussions, are sustained by Maori or Pacific Island players.
Excuse me?
Yeah.
So I'm guessing bleeding to the brain is more? Affects you a lot more than just a normal knock?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's what, if we're kind of define that would be a moderate or severe brain injury. So when we talk about kind of the management of concussion in the community space, kind of New Zealand Rugby, our guidelines are recognize, remove, refer, and our recovery and return. So what that really covers is our guidelines is if you suspect somebody sustained a brain injury, the guidance is to get him off the field, make sure that he gets into a doctor, he does the right things, and then they can come back to play once they've had medical clearance. So kind of before we started this pilot program, what we did is we looked at our 2018 data. So again, we had 2,500 concussions that happened that were reported to ACC. And I don't know if everybody's familiar, but it was a trial started in Northland and then it was rolled out nationally by New Zealand Rugby in 2018. It's called the Blue Card. What the Blue Card is it allows a referee, if he sees a player that he thinks is sustained or is displaying the symptoms of a concussion, he can issue a blue card and that forces a player to leave the field, and they have to do the 21 or 20 to 3 day stand down, and they have to get medical clearance before they return to play. So it kind of puts a formal process around coming back, getting that player off the field, and before they can come back, they have to be signed off by a doctor. So that's kind of what the blue card is. So they rolled that out to all our senior and first 15 level rugby in 2018, and over that we captured about 500 concussions. So we captured about 19% of the concussions that happened with the blue card. So the challenge is we've still got 2,000 concussions that happened. And ideally our recommendation is they're off the field, they do their stand down, and they have to be medically cleared. But the challenge is we have no way of enforcing that or tracking how we're doing in that space, other than hopefully the coach does the right thing and they're medically cleared. But, we have no way of knowing.
Excuse me, was there an education program put in for the coaches and the referees?
Yeah, so there's always been, so referees and coaches each year have to do what is called a Rugby Smart program.
Right.
So it's and part of that, there is a strong component of that covers concussion education. So it covers the recognition of symptoms, the stand down period, and how to look after that player. For referees to issue a blue card, they had to do a concussion specific program, which was run by a doctor, which just talked about how to identify a concussion. Yeah. But definitely the challenge with that is you've got people who don't have a medical background trying to make medical decisions, which, there's pros and cons with that. But I think at the end of the day, decisions are being made, hopefully for player welfare, and they're referring that on to a doctor. I think it's not a bad thing. Yeah.
As far as that one, blue cards on the field,
yeah,
as a referee, all we do is look at symptoms,
yeah,
as opposed to diagnosis, because we're not qualified for that.
No.
So if we see one of the dramatic questions, or you see a symptom, you can basically activate on that as opposed to diagnose. So capturing the stats in that previous one where you've only got 500 basically reported.
Yeah.
The provincial unions don't want to know if there's an injury at training. So most coaches are quite happy to put a person onto a blue card protocol.
Yeah.
If there's an injury at training, but the provincial unions haven't got a process to record that.
Yeah.
And
So
they
that,
don't want to know.
no.
So they only want to know about what happens on the field in a game. And other than that, it's the club or the school's prerogative to look after them, and they don't want to know about it.
No. And I guess that is a challenge.
Mandated stand down period?
Yeah.
They still have the still stand down 21 and 23.
Days.
Yeah.
So under 19 is 23 days stand down, over 19 is 21 days.
Yeah. So, and I totally agree with you, and that's the battle I've been trying to work on. But I guess the challenge is too is there's so many injuries and you've got limited personnel at the PUs. So how do you manage?
Why wouldn't you want to know?
Yeah.
Information in that stats?
It's how having somebody who has capacity to collate that and bring it all in is a challenge, but that's something that New Zealand, hopefully, we're working on. Yeah.
The good thing is it has started. It always takes a start and then
Yeah, no, for sure.
Are you going to talk about the effects of multiple, not just a one-off, but a residual?
Yeah.
Not I can, but not specifically. And I guess what we've done is really around the management of it. There is a lot in the space of kind of that CTE and potentially that space. I haven't planned that I probably won't be talking about, but I can definitely discuss after if that's all right. Cool. So I guess what we wanted to do is really we wanted to put a program in place that addresses the fact that we've got these concussions that aren't being captured. But I guess in order to do that, we really need to understand the landscape of, how are these concussions being reported? Who are they being reported to? And kind of that information around their knowledge and their attitude, what the symptoms are. So what we did in 2017 is we went out to, I think, 22 different first 15 teams. And what we asked, we did a survey looking at their concussion knowledge, their reporting behavior, and their attitudes towards concussions. So what we found is about 70% of those players that we surveyed, indicated they thought they had sustained a suspected concussion, but only about half of those had gone in for a medical diagnosis. We do know concussion non-disclosure, so not reporting concussions, is not unique to rugby. It happens everywhere. Depending on if you're in the States, a lot of the studies range about 30% of players in a multitude of sports don't report concussions. There was a study done in Ireland. They said about in Irish high school, and they said about 50% didn't. So ours is a little bit higher with 70%, but I guess it just highlights the challenges that often players won't disclose a concussion because they don't want to let their team down. Potentially, they don't want to be off for 3 weeks. They didn't know they were concussed. There's a number of challenges in around that. And what we do know is that the non-disclosure of concussions increases as the season goes on. So they're pretty happy to report a concussion at the start of the season, less happy to do so as you get to semi-finals, finals. Yeah.
So it's about 31% medical diagnosis.
Yeah.
If they've reported, does that mean that they registered with NCC?
Yeah. So what we asked is, do you think you've had a concussion? And 70% said yes. And then we asked, the follow-up to that was, have you been into a doctor for that concussion?
Only 31%.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And that was in the games as well as practice?
It was just rugby in general. Yeah. And then we asked them we wanted to understand, well, who are you getting your concussion knowledge from, and who do you feel comfortable telling your concussion or telling when you think you've been a concussed? And the key person for them was a coach. So the coach provides the majority of the concussion information that kids get, and it's the person they feel most comfortable telling when they think they've had a concussion. When we looked at how these kids access kind of healthcare, we know that if you're from a high decile school, so a more wealthy area, you're more likely to report a concussion. And we know that what we found is our Pacifica players were actually less likely to access a doctor than our New Zealand European players. The Pacifica players indicate they're actually more comfortable accessing a nurse, and I think a lot of the times that's a function of there's a school nurse, and usually that's their point of kind of their touch point with the healthcare system. When we looked at kind of awareness of the guidelines, again, showed a similar pattern. So our higher decile schools tended to know more about the concussion guidelines. So this is a stand down period, what the concussion symptoms were, and that our Maori and our Pacific players had less awareness. We also did another study to look specifically just at knowledge and attitudes in 2018. And what we found, and this is probably would make sense, is every year our coaches have to do that Rugby Smart session. So it kind of makes sense that what we found is our coaches knew more about concussion than our players did. But they also had better attitudes towards reporting concussions than our players did. But kind of the interesting thing is what we found is that coaching experience and playing experience correlated to better attitudes. So the longer you've coached, the more likely you are to feel better about pulling one of your players off for a concussion. And if you're a player, the more rugby playing experience you had, the more likely you were to report a concussion. So kind of what we did is we kind of took a step back and said, well, there's a number of issues there. So how do we address this? So I guess, our big issue is that a lot of players don't report the concussion. So that was one of the challenges we had. But then another challenge we have is often if they report a concussion, they get in to see a GP, and potentially that GP doesn't know much about concussions. So then potentially they don't get the right information at the GPs. We also know that most concussions happen in the tackle. So can we do things about tackle education, tackle technique? So I guess there's a lot of different things that play into improving the management of concussions. So I guess the challenge is if we just focused on improving players' reporting of concussions, the challenge is if they go into the doctor and don't get the right information, then it kind of defeats the purpose of them reporting concussions. So what we did, and this kind of illustrates, is we decided, well, let's take a step back. And what we used is called a social ecological framework, which is just a fancy way of we kind of looked at all the different parts that influence how we manage concussion and all the different people that are involved, and tried to put a model together that kind of considers all those factors, from the rules to the first aid attendant on the side of the field, to the baseline testing that happens, to the education players, parents, and the resources available. So it kind of takes a big picture of how do we improve the management of concussion. So what we tried to do is have a light touch everywhere, so kind of do a half-assed job, but a half-assed job with multiple things. So we didn't do a really good job anywhere, but we tried to do a half-assed job everywhere. That makes sense?
Mm-hmm.
So I guess what we do know about the management of concussion is we know that if we get an individual who sustained a concussion into a GP early, they get a better prognosis. So we know that they'll recover faster, they're less likely to have prolonged symptoms. It also reduces the risk of early complications. So if you get a concussion and you go back too soon, we do know that the brain controls not only how you think, but also how you move, right? So if you may be thinking fine, but your coordination might be off. So if your coordination's off, potentially you're at a higher risk of a lower limb injury. And they found that in super kind of at the professional rugby level. So really kind of all that pulls in to say, well, what are our primary objectives here? So really our three main priorities is that one, players are removed from play if they display any symptoms of concussion, they're removed from play. They're referred into a GP. So as a GP is the only person who can diagnose, or a medical doctor is the only person who can diagnose a concussion. And that before they go back to any sort of contact, they're cleared by a doctor. So that's kind of our big three priorities. So really what we did is we took that big framework and we tried to relate everything back to those three objectives.
Why do you think GPs are not necessarily always at point here?
Well, and I guess if you hold that question, the next three slides talk to that. So what we did know historically is that when concussions happen, the majority of people actually, we don't know in New Zealand, but we do know from work that's been done in the States and Canada, historically people would go to ED, and the ED doctor would be their point of entry into the healthcare system. But what we've actually seen in the last couple of years is that's changed. That now kind of 70% of the concussions that happen in that 13 to 18-year-old demographic are actually seeing their primary care physician, so a GP for their healthcare. But the challenge is when we look at the management of concussions in primary care, depending on which study you look at, only about 15 to 50% of GPs are aware of concussion guidelines. Only about 33% of them use an objective tool. So kind of, if we're looking at best practice right now, it would be the SCAT, which is called a Sport Concussion Assessment Tool.
Wow.
About 30% of GPs don't use any guidelines whatsoever for their concussion assessment. And there was a study done over in Australia in Sydney that looked at what happened is they've kind of followed all their concussions through their concussion management journey. And what they found is that 80% of those individuals that got a concussion went in to see a GP. Only 20% of people that got a concussion actually accessed a doctor after that concussion. Of those 20% that accessed a doctor, 80% of them got the wrong information about the management guidelines for their concussion. So it sounds like I'm ragging on GPs, but I'm not, because I guess to put ourselves in the GP's guidelines, since 1980, there's been 33 different guidelines released around the management of concussion. So it's a massive space, and every day I've got about 3 more articles on concussion that I could read. So it's a massive space to be on top of. When we look at concussion, the majority of the research is actually being led by the sports organizations, because I think there's big interest in that, versus the majority of medical conditions of research is led by the medical fraternity. So a lot of the research has been driven by sports, but I guess the challenge is that it's been driven by sports, and it's been done primarily in the States and Canada, where you have kind of access to sport medicine physicians, and you've got access to athletic trainers and physios. So there's kind of well entrenched there. I guess the challenge for sports medicine is they're not limited to a 15-minute window to see a patient, versus GPs, you walk in and they've got 15 minutes to get you in and out the door. The challenges with that too is the SCAT, which is our gold standard for the management of concussion, takes 10 minutes to complete if you know what you're doing.
If you can do it.
Yeah, this is true. And again, if you've ever seen the SCAT, I could show you, but the instructions and how to interpret the scores is about 4 pages long. So it is really quite daunting. So that should take you 10 minutes to do. In 2018, we went out to GPs and asked them to use the SCAT. And we worked with a GP in Horowhenua, and it took him 45 minutes to do the SCAT. So
I've been given the SCAT to do myself, but I've been concussed and can't even sit properly, you know.
yeah, no.
Okay.
So it's I guess the problem is the tools that are currently available don't really work for primary care. So, you know, we have all these resources, but they don't fit within a community context and what we're doing in primary care. So I guess that led us to develop what we've called kind of the concussion pathway. So really, again, we're taking a step back, looking at that framework and said, okay, our challenge is a lot of GPs are really not comfortable managing concussions. And we've got players that aren't reporting concussions. Well, how do we make this work? Well, really, it's important for us is that we got the GPs in the WACA and we're all going to go together. So how do we as a group collectively work together to improve this problem? So what we did after the 2018 season is we got all the GPs that we worked with in the room and said, how do we do a better job with this? So kind of what we came up with is a tool that can be done in 5 minutes that kind of GPs were comfortable doing. So this is a pathway we kind of came up with. So what it looks like is an education component. If you look at the blue, that's kind of our preseason. And then we've got a red is, you know, this is a concussion that happens during a game or a training, how we manage that. Then we've got the recovery and return. So I'm just going to talk about kind of what we did in the preseason space. So we've developed kind of online concussion education. We've got in-person concussion education for players. And what we found is, okay, players aren't going to tell us about their concussions, so there's no point in beating a dead horse. But there's a study done by one of she's part of our research group over in Australia, and she said, well, actually players are really comfortable to look after each other. They're comfortable identifying concussions in their teammates. Well, how do we take that and say, well, actually, you don't need to tell us anything, but you've got to look out for one another. So here's how you recognize a concussion in your teammates. So kind of the education that we've developed really focuses on peer recognition of concussion symptoms. And then we also developed a baseline test. So we kind of modeled this after what happens at Super Rugby. So Super Rugby, you walk in preseason, the baseline test, if you get a concussion, you go through that HIA process, which is they do a pitch side assessment, 24 hours, 48 hours. So it wasn't feasible in the community space, but how can we take that kind of concept and adapt it for the community? So what we did is we took the SCAT and we kind of bastardized it. So we chopped it up and kind of took little components. So this doesn't really mean much, but really this is what we came up with the GPs that we can do in a 5-minute time frame. So we found, if you're familiar with the SCAT, there's a list of 21 symptoms, and it talks about, are you anxious? Do you have irritability? So we went out to teams, and I was in a school in South Auckland. He's like, Miss, I don't know what irritability is. I don't know what anxious means. So we then said, well, actually, we've got some literacy challenges. Yeah, so it's for the adult symptom scale, it's 0 to 6. And then there's 21 kind of what they call symptom descriptors that it goes through. So we found that actually the literacy level of the adult version is too challenging for the majority of our population that we were working with. So we said, well, if they don't understand, it makes the tool invalid. So let's actually use the child SCAT, which is validated for kids 12 and under. So we used the symptom descriptors from the child SCAT. And then we kind of pulled some of the cognitive tasks. So often what GPs report is you get the kid that comes in and says, oh, I'm fine. I just want to get back out and get playing. But what the GPs report is sometimes it's really helpful to have objective tools that say, actually, you're saying you're fine, but you can't walk in a straight line. Or, you know, when we baseline tested you at the start of the season, you get 3 times, you have to remember 10 words. And you remember, let's say 23. I just tested you, only remembered 15. So it gives them some objective measures that can help give them some data to inform their clinical decision. So these are the components we used. And I'll just walk you through. So this is a screenshot of the app that we use. So we do this baseline assessment off a phone. So it just gives you kind of an idea of what it looks like. So again, you've got the instructions on how to do it. And then it says, I'm going to test your memory. I'll read you a list of words. When I'm done, you repeat back to me any words you can remember in any order. And it goes through these 10 set of words. So blanket, lemon, insect. So you go through those words. And then the end of that, what the individual does is they get them to repeat back the words that they remember. And you indicate that. And that's kind of tracks your progress. So you do that 3 times. And then you just tick through those, the ones that the player or the patient remembers. And then we've got, so again, this is a busy slide, but all I'm showing you here is this is some of this. So we've just submitted this out for publication, but this looks at the 21 symptoms that we've pulled from the Child Scat. So this just gives you an indication. So World Rugby has done a lot of research at the professional level with this tool, and what they found is about 98% of players they test don't report any symptoms at baseline. What we found is 95% of the players we test in the community report all sorts of symptoms. So it just kind of gives you a profile. So the challenge we have is we're asking doctors to use these tools, but how do you interpret? So if a kid comes in and they scores a 23 on the, what does that mean? So what we want to do is actually, we can give you, here's a normative range. So if I look at the next slide here, I can say, if a kid walks in and he scores about between 5 and 17, that's pretty normal. So that's kids, healthy kids without any history of concussion, that's their normal range. If they start to score beyond that, that may raise some red flags and questions like, maybe this is worse than what I'd expect to see. So again, the idea is to take some data, give them some information so they can help them make a decision on how they interpret that. So again, this is just our high school kids. So their median score was 11.3. And again, if we look at the professionals, the median score is 1. So it gives you, there's quite a difference between what we see at the community level versus a professional level. And they endorsed about 9 symptoms, which at the professional level, they endorsed just 1. This is our senior club level. So again, this is slightly lower than we see at the high school. Their median score is 11 in the previous. This was about 8. And it was 9 in the previous one, and they were reporting about 6 symptoms. So it just gives you some information that you can help to make some decisions on. And then I guess when we look at the symptoms, kind of the most common one was easily distracted, forgetful, and often tired, which these kids scoring, 2 or 3 for most of them, just at baseline. Does that make, I know it's a lot of data on there, but does that kind of make some sense?
So with the testing done with the app, is that feeding back to a database?
Yeah, so this is, so the app's run by CSX, which is a company out of Auckland, so they store all that data in a cloud. Yeah. So then what happens is we baseline tested you, you go out, I'm running around, I play for Otago Girls High School, and, I make a tackle, but I whack my head on her knee as I'm making the tackle. I get up, stumble, coach is like, I don't think you're all right. He pulls me off the field. At the end of the game, what happens is we kind of call this a team lead, but, it could be a coach, it could be a manager, it could be a parent. So what we do is we set that individual for each team up with the app, and then what they do is they log the concussion. So that kind of looks like this. I'll just walk you through it. So again here, this information is captured, and then it's sent to the GP. So yeah, I saw the injury. They had repeated vomiting, and you'll see up there. So I just wonder if I can pause it. Oh, no, I can. So you'll see those red flags. And if you just notice below, what we found is that when we went to coaches and asked, what would you do with an unconscious player? 50% of our coaches said, well, they didn't say they wouldn't refer them to ED, which if you've been knocked unconscious, you should go to ED. So that raises a flag that we talk about. If you look at your concussions, there's what they call the red flag symptoms, which means that potentially we've got a mild injury, we may have a bleed or something more severe. So with those red flags, nobody remembers them. The only time you really care about them is when the kid's in front of you, you're like, oh shit, I wish I remembered what those red flags are. So what we've tried to do with the tool is we've tried to build those into that process. So when you're logging the concussion, so you'll notice here, and it just pops up on the bottom of the screen, But as you'll see, it tells you that they should seek immediate care. So I saw it, yes, they tick repeated vomiting, and you see this player needs immediate medical attention. Mm-hmm. Then it talks about the symptoms they're reporting at the time of injury, and we removed this player as soon as they displayed it. It happened during a tackle, is a head with a shoulder, and then they can put comments in here as well. So, and the GP will get all that information. So one of the challenges GPs report is these kids come in and they don't know them from a bar of soap and say they feel fine. They don't have a lot of information to make a decision with, versus now we have this information that's feeding in the GPs, and that helps them make this decision. So, it's not the GP saying, okay, well, I don't think you're concussed, when the kid goes back to the coach and says, dude, you were knocked out. Of course you were concussed. So it just helps them with that information so they can make a better decision about that. And kind of the cool thing there is the comments section. So often we'll see, and this happens all the time, player takes a hit, seems to be fine, no trouble. They play the whole game, end of the game, 5 minutes after the end, they start to feel shitty and, the symptoms come on. Don't know how it happened, but again, they could say in here, player took a hit during the game, appeared to be fine, but went downhill after the game. So
and sometimes it's not even after the game, it can be like 6
yeah,
days
no, for sure. And that gives them the ability to send that so the GP has that information.
Turns out the training at the other teams practice.
Yeah. What's going on? So again, when they log that concussion, you'll see there just below that suspected concussion, there's an email notification goes out. So what happens is when that team manager does that process, there's an email that goes out to the player and the parent, the school or the club contact, and also the provincial union. So really looping everybody into the circle. So we know, the coach doesn't have to find my mom on the sideline who's not there because she's looking after my baby sister or whatever. When they log that, they know there's an email that's gone to whoever's mom and dad just to loop them in. Because often we hear, little Billy got concussed on Saturday. Mom and dad didn't find out. Little Billy's been in school since Monday. It's now Tuesday. He suffered through 3 days. And then finally somebody says, oh, actually, he took head knock. That might be why he's struggling through school. So it just kind of loops in that communication. Mm-hmm. The key thing about the email that goes to the player and the parent is there's an access code in there. So that access code, the player they can take with them when they go into the doctor. And when they give that to the doctor, that gives the doctor the ability to access that individual's baseline. So what that looks like, you can see here, is this is the same thing that we did at the start of the season. The GP can then pull up that information and look and see, when Danielle came in or did this in the preseason, she got 7 out of the 10 words right on her trial. So when I repeat it and I only get 3, they'll know that I've done worse than when I did at my baseline. Does that make sense? So again, it just allows them to compare apples to apples. So, if my memory was terrible to begin with and they go in and they repeat and they're like, oh, your memory's terrible. Actually, it was terrible before I got the head knock. It just allows them to compare apples to apples.
And often the GP is good because they've got all the history as well, because the person has to remember the bits of it, but the GP's got it all written down over the time.
Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah. And then what happens is, so at the end of the piece too, is that end of the GP assessment, they complete their assessment. We've actually put all the current guidelines in. So you do the assessment and this is, okay, you've got a concussion. Well, here's what you need to know about getting back to school and work. And here's what we need to do for getting back to play. And it's got, the 21, 23 day stand down. So they don't have to search and they don't have to find it. All that information's there. Mm-hmm. So they go through their graduated return to play. So with that, there's kind of a set process, but you start off with light exercise. You go up to moderate to hard exercise, get the blood flowing, see how the brain deals with that. Then, the next week, then you can start into your non-contact training. So you're getting the blood flowing, but you're also increasing the cognitive load. So you start to think, see how the brain deals with that. If you're no symptoms with that, then we get you back in for your medical clearance. That doctor repeats the same process. If you appear to be all good, he'll give you the green light to say, yep, Danielle's okay to go back to contact. An email goes out to those same stakeholders saying, she's been reviewed by Dr. Smith. Dr. Smith is happy for her to go to contact, or Dr. Smith says, nah, you still need some time. then the email goes out saying, hey, I've reviewed her and she still needs to continue through that graduated return to play. Yeah.
Or ACC?
Yes, we're just hold that question. I'll come to that. Sorry, I don't mean to put on pause. So what we did is we did this last year. Just there's a few hiccups here and there with COVID, but we did get through it. So we ran this system through 3 provincial unions, and what we found is we had about 1,500 players involved in the study, and we had 127 concussions that were reported over the length of the study. Of those, we had 125 of those concussions were logged in the app. So we captured 98% of those. And of those 127 concussions, we can say hand on heart, 80% of those were medically cleared before they went back. So I guess if we think back to that blue card where we're only capturing about 20, 80 is a hell of a lot better than our 20. So I guess that just gives us, we haven't changed anything, but hopefully we've put structures in place to ensure that players, coaches, parents are all really clear on what has to happen to go back to play. So this just gives you a little bit more detail. So again, what I just spoke to, but it kind of gives you a sense of we've got a lot better data and better understanding of what's going on after concussions happened. So to speak to your question, so we've run this over the last two years, and we've kind of got the data to now say actually a lot of people think there's really good value in it. Feedback has been positive. It's been an iterative process. We've had to change a lot of things, but I think what we've come out with is something that works at a community space. So ACC's strike some interest. So we're now looking at a pilot in the North Harbour region with 8 schools where we're rolled across all their winter sports. So we're piloting to see, I guess, the unique thing is rugby has structures that potentially are very different from what happens in netball or football or soccer. So it's trying to see this works in rugby, does it actually work in other sports? Yeah, so there's a number of people that have been that actually make this happen. So there's been this is just to acknowledge them, and I guess if you want some of the references, but yeah, that's kind of it in a nutshell. Does anybody have any questions about the process that I haven't touched on?
Yeah, it's awesome to see the improved kit training.
Yeah.
But what about the stuff we're seeing about saliva testing and whatever that is, some kind of chemical or whatever?
Yep.
Markers.
Yep. Yeah, so I think that was just in the BBC maybe yesterday. I think they were. So they talked about there's a test now that they report captured about 94% of the concussions, which I think it would be fabulous because I guess